Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Faerie Forged by L.R. Braden, narrated by Heather Costa. Chapter 1. Bronze dust and red buffing compound coated my work surface, my jeans, and my hands. Pulling down my respirator mask so it hung over my collarbone like a necklace, I set the Dremel aside and, fingers clasped, pressed my palms toward the ceiling until my back popped. My stomach growled, and I glanced longingly at the dregs of coffee staining my empty mug. Breakfast had been a long time ago. The air in the studio smelled of warm metal and sulfur patina, and my nose twitched with the warning of an oncoming sneeze. Sniffing and brushing the back of my wrist over my upper lip, I snatched up a polishing cloth to wipe out the residual red rouge caked in the corners of the bronze queen chess piece. I was careful to keep my mind clear as I worked, blocking off my emotions so they didn't accidentally spill over into Uncle Saul's Christmas present due to my magical ability. That would be a fine gift. Here's a fun game full of anxiety and stress that makes you sick to your stomach when you touch the pieces. When the queen shone with a mirror finish, I set her beside her king, ready to lead her army across the cherrywood chessboard. On one side of the battlefield, fractal pattern pawns guarded a court of frozen snowflakes, all sharp angles and hard lines, their shapes as bright and clear as their finish. Across the no-man's land of checkered space, a second army sat, ready for war. These pieces were dark, stained to an oil-slick finish. In contrast to their counterparts, the patinaed courts swooped and curled with organic curves. The set was done. One more item checked off my to-do list, and not a moment too soon. I'd be on my way to the Fae Winter Festival in less than a day. My tutors, Kai and Hortense, had been cramming almost every waking moment with Fae etiquette lessons to help me survive my debut at the Court of Enchantment. Most of the lessons boiled down to, don't be yourself. Standing, I brushed what metal dust I could off my jeans, then scrubbed my hands raw at the sink in the corner. I had a box all prepared for Saul's gift, kept safe from the studio's mess in a cabinet off to one side of my workspace. The chess pieces each slipped into individual pockets in two felt-lined drawers under the board. Once the armies were laid to rest, I set the board on a bed of bubble wrap, covered it, and tucked it in. I secured the box with packing tape and scribbled the address for Uncle Saul's New York apartment, the closest thing he had to a home, across the top. Then I cleaned my Dremel, placed it back on its peg on the wall, and swept up the evidence of my work. Straightening, I turned a slow circle, making sure everything was tidy. Thanks to the time dilation between realms, this would be the last time I set foot in my studio for at least a week, assuming I came back at all. A colorful sheet hung like a ghost in one corner of the room, suspended on the copper sculpture it was keeping safe from my creation process. All the tools were in their places, the kilns were off, the forge was cold. Grabbing Saul's present, I turned out the lights and locked the studio door. The mid-morning sky was clear but cold, tightening the skin across my cheeks. Tendrils of mist still huddled in shadows, close to the ground where the sun couldn't find them. I breathed deep and crossed the clearing to my house. I set Saul's package on the breakfast bar that separated the kitchen from the living room and glanced at the clock on the wall. Crap, I only had 30 minutes until my shift at the bookstore. I flew through the back door to Magpie Books, purse dangling from one hand, keys clenched in the other. I'd stripped off my dirty clothes, wiped the worst smudges off my face with a damp rag, and pulled on a clean outfit in 2 minutes flat. I'd also careened down the Boulder Canyon like a maniac, so I was only 5 minutes late for my shift. Shoving my belongings into the locker in the back room, I pushed through the employee-only door to the store, proper, and jogged up an aisle of bookcases toward the front. Dozens of people were perusing the shelves, arms piled high with popular titles, and the front door jingled constantly with the flow of holiday traffic. The scent of pine and cinnamon mixed with the smell of books and coffee. A row of overstuffed stockings hung on one wall, each embroidered with an employee's name. Mine was third from the end. Kayla stood by the register. Her platinum blonde hair was pinned back from her face with 2 tiny silver clips. She wore her usual high-collared, ankle-length dress to hide the gossamer pixie wings she'd once shown me. I licked my lips, recalling the heady sensation caused by the magical dust that came off those wings. "Hey, Kayla, sorry, My apologies stalled as my gaze shifted past Kayla to the cafe area, and a knot lodged in my throat. Standing at the corner was an agent of the Paranatural Task Force, PTF for short. He wore blue jeans, brown boots, and a button-up shirt with a beige plaid pattern. Nothing to mark him as a PTF agent, but I'd recognize Benjamin O'Connell anywhere. Hard to forget a man who'd sworn to ruin your life, especially when he had the means and authority to actually do it. Clenching my fists, I continued past the register, ignoring Kayla's furrowed brow. I stepped up to O'Connell. "What are you doing here?" O'Connell raised one eyebrow. "Getting a coffee." I crossed my arms. "Why here?" He shrugged. "Why not?" Emma, the barista, pulled a lever on the copper machine behind the counter, and a hiss of steam poured out. She jingled as she worked, her many chains and piercings clicking with each motion, but her usual perkiness was absent. Her shoulders sagged, and when she turned, I saw dark circles below her eyes. Last month, Emma took and passed the test to become a practitioner, a rare human who could use magic. She'd also convinced a local healer named Luke to take her on as his apprentice, which would explain her glazed expression. I knew from experience that using magic was exhausting. I inched closer to O'Connell and pitched my voice lower. "What do you want?" "I was worried you might get lonely after I saw the list of potentials brought in this morning." My heart stuttered, and my mouth went dry. Potentials were people reported for exhibiting magical behavior. They were rounded up, dragged to the nearest PTF facility, and tested for paranatural abilities. I'd seen firsthand how brutal PTF tests could be, and the consequences of failing. I was just lucky my ability to handle iron protected me from suspicion, since that was the main way they tested for Fae heritage. Not all my friends were so lucky. If he'd gotten his hands on any of them, I swallowed the sour taste in my mouth. "Gonna take all day to get them processed," he sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, the picture of an overworked employee just trying to get through the day. "Then there's the testing. Could be days, weeks maybe, backed up as we are." He leaned toward me like a friend sharing a secret. His nearness made my skin itch. "We've been up to our eyeballs in suspicion reports since the election results came in." Colorado's governor-to-be, Gary Anderson, had run a purity campaign, aligning himself with the extremist group that endorsed wholesale slaughter of anyone with a drop of magic in their blood. I'd already noticed several disturbing changes around town, like iron bead curtains hanging in doorways, anti-face stickers in storefronts, and a recent call for magical segregation in schools. News that the number of reports had risen since the election wasn't surprising, but it was disturbing. The same thing happened right before the Faerie Wars broke out, when tension between the humans and Fae had been at its highest. I shuddered to think how much worse the situation was going to get come January, when Anderson was officially sworn in. "I guess between the heifer," O'Connell cut his eyes to Kayla, "and the witch," he nodded toward Emma. "You've got all the company you need," he smiled. "For now." Emma set a to-go cup on the counter, and O'Connell stepped away from me to grab it. He lifted the steaming container to his lips, hissing when the hot liquid hit his tongue. Then he raised his drink in salute and walked out the door. "Hey, Alex," Emma smiled. The steel ring in her lip glinted. "Want your usual?" I set my hands on the counter, leaving sweaty smudges on the glass. "Was that guy bothering you?" She frowned. "No. Why?" I shook my head and walked back the way I'd come. Passing Kayla, I said, "I need to make a phone call," and hustled back through the employee-only door before either of my coworkers could do more than blink. Yanking open my locker, I grabbed my cell phone and stood with my finger over the contacts icon. Did O'Connell really have one or more of my friends, or was he trying to trick me into giving someone away? Could he have bugged my phone? I frowned. The CSI shows on TV always talked about cloning cell phones, but people had to steal the phones first, and even the PTF needed a warrant for a legal phone tap. I scrolled through entries, wondering who was most exposed. My first thought when O'Connell hinted a friend had been taken was of Kai. But O'Connell wouldn't have called him a potential. Kai was a fully registered Fae, living at my house on a visa granted by the PTF. Plus, O'Connell had already dragged Kai in for extensive testing. I shivered, recalling the way Kai had screamed during those tests. No, Kai was safe. As safe as a Fae could be, considering the growing influence of purity. But James, a vampire hiding in plain sight, was definitely not safe. O'Connell knew we were friends, and potentially more. Our complicated relationship status had come under close scrutiny when James was investigated for murder. I'd since slammed the brakes on dating, but the jolt of dopamine and the way my body tightened whenever he was around made it painfully clear that my heart and my head weren't on the same page. I pressed the call button. As soon as the line connected, I asked, "Where are you?" "The nest." The sound of James's voice loosened some of the ropes of tension squeezing my chest. I rubbed my forehead, fighting back a headache. James had spent the better part of a week preparing for the arrival of a new master vampire, some woman named Victoria, who'd claimed ownership of the Denver area nearly as soon as we'd put the old master down. How she'd known about the vacancy so fast was anybody's guess, but she'd come to town 2 nights ago. "You're all right?" I asked. "No problems?" "I'm fine." Worry crept into his voice, stretching his syllables. "Has something happened?" "It's nothing. I'll see you at dinner tonight." I disconnected before he could press me for more information. If he wasn't O'Connell's prisoner, I didn't have time to waste chatting with him. And the last thing he needed while dealing with a new, powerful vampire was to be distracted. I scanned through my remaining contacts. Some names were missing, like Chase and Jinx, the Shifter siblings crashing at my house, and Hortense, the tutor sent by my grandfather to fill the gaps in Kai's lessons. They were all full Fae, and I had no way to contact them, except face-to-face. But Chase had been a snoring ball of gray fur at the end of my bed when I left for work, and Jinx had been watching television. I bit my lip. I couldn't imagine Hortense being careless enough to get caught by the likes of O'Connell. That left the wolves. I knew several members of the local werewolf pack, thanks to my recent exploits, but I didn't have all their numbers. One number I did have was Mark's. As the leader of the pack, he was sure to know if any of his members had been picked up by the PTF. The line rang and rang. No answer. I took a deep breath. No reason to panic yet. Maybe he was just in the shower. Scrolling further down the list, I clicked the entry for Oz, a pack member I'd actually known before I discovered, rather violently, that werewolves were real. The line rang. I bit my lower lip, my heart rate starting to climb. No answer there either. I didn't have a direct line to Sarah Nazari, a werewolf detective with the Boulder Police Department, and Sophie, my human friend turned werewolf, the night we both learned they were more than just stories, had her phone privileges revoked after sneaking out to go clubbing and nearly shifting in a building packed tight with tasty mortals. I thumped my cell phone against my forehead. A couple missed calls was hardly conclusive, but my gut told me O'Connell had gotten his hands on some or all of the werewolves. Waves of dread rolled through me. I had to know for sure. Lifting the phone one more time, I called Maggie. A month ago, talking to Maggie would have been the most natural thing in the world. Now, the prospect made my insides writhe. Maggie was one of my few remaining human friends, and the only one I'd managed to keep completely out of the craziness my life had become. But my secrets had driven a wedge between us, and I wasn't sure how to bridge that gap. Before I'd walked into the near-certain death of Merrick's nest, I'd written a letter to Maggie explaining everything and apologizing for keeping her in the dark, just in case. I hadn't died. I also hadn't given her the letter yet. I'd stuffed it in my nightstand drawer, too afraid to face the fallout of laying my secrets bare, especially as the gulf between us grew larger. "Alex?" Maggie's voice was sharp. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Are you at the store?" I looked at the employee door, then at the exit. "Yeah, but I need to leave." "Bloody hell, Alex. Your shift just started, and this is the last shift you've got before the 2 weeks you requested off during the busiest shopping season of the year." Her voice rose as she spoke, her London accent becoming more pronounced. "I know, but something's come up." A loud sigh came through the phone. "Something always comes up with you these days, and you've told me bugger all about it." "I know, How long?" "What? How long do I need to cover? The morning, the whole day, forever?" I shuffled my feet and looked up at the speckled ceiling tiles. "Better not count on me today." "I can't ever count on you anymore." Dead air filled the line as I struggled to find something to say, something to make things right between us. But she was right. "I can't take this anymore, Alex. Not with—" a sharp exhale and a shaky breath. "You're sacked." The words dropped like a bomb in my head, splintering my thoughts into a million shards of jagged shrapnel. I opened my mouth to argue, to come clean about my heritage, to explain why I'd missed all those shifts. But all that came out was a ringing silence. "I'm sorry, Alex." The line went dead. Pressure built behind my eyes. I'd thought about quitting the bookstore dozens of times, usually when I was fighting to get out of my nice warm bed before the sun came up. But I'd never really considered it. Magpie Books had been Maggie's dream, and we'd built it together. I'd been there from the start, and I'd always assumed I'd be there till the end. Magpie was supposed to be a place I would always belong. Dropping the phone in my purse, I blinked until my tears were no longer in danger of falling. Somehow, I had to repair my friendship with Maggie. I couldn't afford to burn any more bridges. But first, I needed to find out what, if anything, had happened to the werewolves. Chapter 2. Rolling out of the lot, I headed back up the canyon toward Netherland, retracing my morning drive. Boulder Creek was sculpted in ice, patches of running water showing through only where it tumbled against rocks. The path alongside the river was shoveled clear and spread with thick pink salt crystals, until I reached the edge of town. Then packed snow claimed the sidewalk, marred by tire and boot tread. Ice sparkled on Barker Reservoir as I came up over a hill and headed down into the valley that held Netherland. But I turned off the main road before reaching the town proper. I passed by the dirt driveway that connected my little piece of nowhere to the rest of the world, and several others just like it. Then I turned up the road to Mark's house. He lived about a mile back from the main road on a mountain estate similar to my own. A large yellow sign proclaiming bodily harm to trespassers greeted me at the edge of his property. The house was 2 stories above ground, and 2 below, including a dungeon I hoped never to see again. My Jeep shuddered to a stop behind a silver pickup truck, a red Jetta, and a black SUV. I whistled. Somebody's home. I stepped out of the cab, but hesitated with my hand still on the Jeep's door. That many vehicles meant I was likely to find quite a gathering inside. I'd met a number of werewolves over the past 2 months, but usually one at a time. The idea of being surrounded by them was... I rubbed my hand over the jacket sleeve covering my left arm, imagining the scars beneath. There hadn't been much I could do against even one werewolf, and the group inside might not be happy to see me, since my last escapade resulted in several of them getting hurt. My breath formed clouds that hung like fog around my face while I hesitated. Finally, I stepped away from my Jeep and crunched past the line of vehicles leading to Mark's front porch. I raised my hand to ring the bell, but before my finger connected, the door swung open. It wasn't Mark who answered. Standing just inside the door was a fine-boned, middle-aged Asian woman with papery brown skin. She stood straight and tall, except for a slight bow in her shoulders, but still only came up to my chin. A few strands of jet black streaked the loose steel-gray braid that trailed over her shoulder. The woman pursed her lips. "Alex Blackwood?" I dropped my hand back to my side and raised an eyebrow. "Do I know you?" Then I remembered. I'd seen her before, in the aftermath of the vampire nest infiltration. She'd made a report to Mark about the wolves who'd been injured during the battle. "You may call me Yumiko," the woman said. "Why are you here?" I frowned. "I was looking for Mark." "He's not here." My fear ratcheted up a notch. "Did the PTF take him?" Yumiko's expression stiffened. "What do you know of it?" "I had a visit from a PTF agent this morning who implied someone I knew had been brought in for testing. When I couldn't get Mark on the phone, I raised my hands, shrugging. I came to investigate." She pursed her lips, then stepped back from the door. "Come inside." Stomping my boots on the welcome mat, I stepped into the home of the local werewolf alpha. The smell of frying sausage hit me on a surge of warm air when I crossed the threshold. Pushing the door closed behind me, I followed Yumiko's bobbing braid farther into the house. A lanky black man lounging on a faded blue recliner peeked over the top of last month's Make magazine in the living room. I didn't recognize him, but if he was comfortable in Mark's home, chances were he was a werewolf. He watched me pass, then tossed the magazine onto an already cluttered coffee table. "In here," Yumiko gestured through an alcove to one side, and I followed her through to the kitchen. A rustic wooden table and chairs filled one side of the room. The middle of the room was taken up by a large marble-topped island surrounded by bar stools. A slender man with reddish-brown hair perched on one of the stools. He wore a checkered shirt and a tweed jacket. A pair of rectangular glasses sat on his nose. Behind those lenses, his eyes were red and puffy. He lifted a hand in greeting. "Remember me?" His face was easy enough to place. He'd been my ride home after the vampire infiltration. But I'd been so exhausted after coming back from the dead that the trip home was a blur. I racked my brain for a name, but came up empty. He smiled. "Gilbert, but you can call me Gil." Beyond the island, a large Hispanic man with dark hair and darker eyes was standing by the stove in a plaid, grease-spattered apron. "What's she doing here?" The cook jabbed a pair of metal tongs in my direction. "Don't mind Jed." Yumiko motioned me to one of the island stools. "He's just cranky because he hasn't had breakfast yet." The man, Jed, pressed his lips together and turned his back on the room. Tongs scraped, and a storm of violent sizzling ensued, punctuated by muttered curses. "You sure Mark would be okay with this, Auntie you?" The man from the living room had followed us. He now leaned against the arch, arms crossed over a baggy gray sweater. "Her being able to ID so many of us?" "Mark vouches for her," Gilbert said, "and so does Sarah." Jed snorted and began lifting seared sausages out of his pan and piling them on a nearby plate. "Sarah wanted to kill her," Gil shrugged. "She got over it." "Good to know," I muttered. "Besides," Yumiko said, pinning me with an unyielding look, "it's not like we don't know her secret, too." A shudder rippled through me. Somehow it hadn't occurred to me that the whole werewolf pack, including a bunch of people I'd never met, would know I was a halfer, part human, part fae. Was this how Mark had convinced them not to kill me when I hadn't turned into one of them? Since I'd never registered with the PTF as I was supposed to, my secret was like a looming death sentence. If I was outed, the best I could hope for would be exile to the Fae Reservation. More likely, I'd be locked up in a testing facility and spend the rest of my life as a PTF guinea pig while scientists tried to discover why I was immune to iron. And if they ever did, my relationship to the Fae Lord of Enchantment was a secret even the wolves didn't know. So how did the PTF get their hands on Mark? I'd have thought he'd run rather than risk exposing you all. Except it wasn't just Mark, Yumiko said. Sarah and Oz have been taken as well. I gripped the island, finding comfort in the solid stone. How could they have found so many of you? Yumiko crossed her arms. The PTF has only ever needed suspicion to pull people in for testing, and with Governor-elect Anderson's victory, they've become more aggressive. She looked away, and her eyes became unfocused. I hate to think what his policies will mean for the paranatural community once he takes office. I shook my head, trying to recall the tests administered in schools when the Fae first came. Scraps of iron shavings were mixed with blood samples and tested for reaction. Chances were they'd made some changes since I was in middle school, but when I'd come out to my adoptive guardian, Uncle Saul, he'd assured me the standard PTF test wouldn't identify me as Fae. As he would know, being a high-ranking official in the organization. If I could pass thanks to my immunity to iron, maybe the werewolves could too. PTF tests are designed for Fae. If it's just the basic test, a werewolf should be able to pass. Maybe, maybe not, Yumiko sighed. Either way, it's a moot point. What do you mean? Ceramic clinked against marble as Jed set his plate on the island and pulled up a stool. The moon. Mark might be okay, but Oz... He shook his head. Considering the stress he's under, I doubt he'll make it to the full moon. Sarah won't do much better, Gil added. He paled visibly as he spoke, and his hands fisted on his thighs. I tapped my fingers against the stone countertop as an idea started to form in my swirling thoughts. Maybe I can help, Jed snorted. I owe you for that debacle with the vampires, I said. Speaking of which, where's Sophie? Gil looked away. Yumiko just scowled. The man still standing in the arch said, She's around. I nodded and let it go. She wasn't a prisoner of the PTF, a good thing considering the complete lack of control she'd shown the last time we were together. If O'Connell had gotten hold of her, there'd be confirmation of werewolves by the end of the day. Sophie's safety was a relief, but I was happy not to have to see her in the flesh. There'd been a time when Sophie and I were friends, before I'd invited her on the hike that turned her into a werewolf, before her outburst in Abandon, a vampire-owned dance club, kicked off a cycle of imprisonment and torture that led to the wolves bailing my ass out of the fire when shit went sideways. Before a lot of things. "And what exactly can you do?" Jed spoke around a mouthful of sausage. "You can't even—" "Jed," Yumiko cut him off without raising her voice, then turned to me. "If you can help, Uncle Saul was a big enough muckety-muck in the PTF organization that he could probably pull some strings to get a few potentials released. He was also important enough that it would be pretty damn strange for him to do so, and the last thing I needed was to raise red flags for O'Connell to follow. I can't promise anything, but I know someone who might be able to get them out before the full moon." Gil set a hand on my forearm. "Please try, Sarah. She's my mate. If they find out about her..." "We're all done." Jed stabbed his fork into a sausage. Clear liquid seeped from the wounds. "Once they're sure about even one of us, they'll hunt down the rest. They'll cage us, study us, and kill us." The smell of cooked meat suddenly made my stomach clench, and I looked away as Jed bit into his skewered sausage. I nodded. "I'll make the call." I pulled my arm out from under Gil's hand, trying to ignore the squishy, gnashing sounds of Jed enjoying his breakfast, and slid off my stool. "I'll let you know what he says." The man who hadn't introduced himself watched me pass. His arms were still crossed, but the edge of his lip lifted when I met his eyes. "Good luck," he said. "For all our sakes." I was halfway across the living room when a familiar voice stopped me in my tracks. "You think it's a coincidence that only wolves taken were the ones you interacted with?" Pulse thundering in my ears, I turned. Sophie was peeking out from the laundry room that led to the back door. It also led to the basement, and below that, the dungeon. The long cascade of her hair had been cut short. Blonde clumps stuck up every which way on her head. Her cheeks and eyes were sunken, her lips thin. My fingers curled into fists. She might not have meant to leave me to the tender mercies of a sadistic vampire, any more than I'd intentionally led her into the jaws of a rampaging werewolf, but that rationale didn't quell the wave of anger that boiled through me when I saw her. From the look in her eyes, she hadn't forgiven me yet either. "They didn't take you. I've been on lockdown since—" We both looked away. "You shouldn't be up here." The man who'd been leaning against the arch stepped between us, eyes locked on Sophie. His voice rumbled like rocks in an avalanche. "Back off, Dylan. I just wanted to say hello." Dylan kept glaring until Sophie dropped her gaze to the floor. Then he straightened and looked at me. "Don't you have a call to make?" With one last look at Sophie, I pushed through the front door and trotted to the Jeep. I cranked the heat up to chase back the cold that had seeped into the cab, and thought of Mark, Sarah, and Oz in the PTF's basement, aka torture chamber. Werewolves weren't Fae. They were humans who'd been infected, changed. They didn't have the protection of the Faerie peace accords, flimsy though those were. If the PTF found out what the werewolves really were, they'd be hunted, trapped, and experimented on. "You think it's a coincidence the only wolves taken were the ones you interacted with?" Sophie's words pounded in my mind like a hammer. O'Connell was after me, but he'd take down anyone associated with me if it gave him a chance to hurt me. I'd seen as much when he targeted Kai for the murder of a human woman, despite having no evidence against him. I couldn't let the werewolves suffer O'Connell's misplaced wrath. I pulled out my cell phone. Uncle Saul spent a good deal of time out of the country. Even if he was willing to help, he might not be in a position to do so. At least, not in time. Pushing the thought away, I pulled up his entry in my contact list and pressed the call button. His voicemail picked up right away. Stammering through a greeting, I left a message for him to contact me as soon as possible. I couldn't risk leaving a detailed message, even if I could find a way to explain the situation quickly. Hopefully, by the time he called back, I'd have thought of a way to convince him to break 3 people out of PTF lockup, without telling him they were werewolves. Kai's little beige Toyota was parked in front of my house when I pulled up. The engine was still clicking as its warmth was sapped by the mountain air. He must have just gotten back from his shift at the convenience store. Crunching across the ice-crusted yard, I stomped a few times on the porch and pushed open the front door. "Wouldn't make a difference." Hortense, the curmudgeonly old river hag sent to tutor me on Fae protocol, was standing, arms crossed, in front of the drooping 4-foot Christmas tree in my living room.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?